That soft cotton tee on your skin may have soaked in caustic soda. Not for a cleaner wash, not an accident. That harsh step makes cotton softer, holds color better, and keeps shape after washing. Cotton fabric once came off flat and fuzzy, nothing like today's crisp knit. This mill's transformation begins somewhere most people never think to look: inside a raw cotton bale. Inside the bale, fibers sit dense and slightly greasy with natural cotton wax, packed so tight steel claws have to tear them apart first. Most everyday tees start with upland cotton, not this silky premium kind, but the tougher, cheaper cotton used for mass-market knitwear. Once it disappears under dye, print, and a logo, most shoppers never know the difference. Opened bales move through a picker that blows out leaves and dirt still clinging from the field, leaving only clean white fluff behind. For the shopper, cotton labeled combed has already had its shortest, roughest fibers removed. From there, the fluff feeds into a carding machine that combs every fiber the same direction, the way you'd brush out tangled hair until it lies flat. But the softest tees take one extra step most factories skip: combing. For every ton of cotton, nearly 300 pounds can be combed out and thrown aside, not because it is dirty, but because it is too short to keep the fabric feeling smooth. What remains twists into yarn so tightly that a single t-shirt's worth could stretch farther than 10 football fields end to end. Thin, strong, ready for the knitting machines next door.
Now the yarn feeds into a circular knitting machine, and this is where the shirt starts looking like a shirt. Dozens of needles loop the yarn into a continuous tube of fabric, spinning it out row by row, like a sock forming around an invisible foot. That is why some better t-shirts have no seam down either side. The body was knitted as one round sleeve of fabric from the very first row, never cut from two flat pieces at all. Then comes the harshest bath in the whole process. The fabric is pulled taut and soaked in caustic soda, a chemical strong enough to dissolve grease in seconds. Under that stretch, the cotton fibers swell and smooth out, opening up just enough to grab dye more evenly later. A change that cannot be undone. It's the quiet reason some cotton shirts keep their color for years, while others look tired after only a few washes. Only then does the fabric reach the dye vats, where color locks into the fiber itself, instead of simply coating the outside. Deep, even, and color-fast, the fabric gets rinsed, dried, and rolled onto heavy bolts, ready for cutting. The rolled fabric moves to an automated cutter that reads the pattern like a digital template, slicing dozens of shirt panels at once with a laser-guided blade. But the cut panels still face the hardest part of t-shirt making, keeping stretchy fabric from wandering under the needle. On high-speed sewing lines, cameras and guides help keep the edges lined up, but the setup still depends on trained operators. Even a split-second hesitation can pucker an entire seam. Too much pull, and the side seam twists. Too little, and the collar loses its snap. The collar band goes on last, with a stretch seam that snaps back into shape after being pulled over a head thousands of times. A tiny detail nobody notices until it gives out. Folding machines fold each shirt into that crisp, retail-ready rectangle in about 2 seconds flat. The same fold you unfold at home and can never quite put back together. Some shirts even hide a paper-thin RFID chip inside the care label, so a store can scan a whole stack without opening a single folded shirt. Sealed in a poly bag, boxed, and ready to ship. The final test is color. An inspector checks each batch under controlled light, because a shirt can look perfect in the mill and still look wrong next to last week's batch on a store shelf. If the shade drifts, the whole batch stops there. Sample shirts are then washed, stretched, and measured again, because the real test is not how the tee looks on day one, but whether it still looks like itself after laundry day. But a t-shirt is rarely the only thing you pull on each morning. Socks come next. Unlike a shirt, they're not cut into shape at all. They're knitted into a pocket for your foot from the first stitch.
In 1589, an English clergyman was so frustrated watching hand knitting that he built a machine to do it faster. But Queen Elizabeth I refused to patent it, afraid it would put every hand knitter out of work. Back then, a pair of socks could take a full day to finish. In this mill, a sock gets finished in under a minute. A sock that says cotton is rarely just cotton. Pure cotton feels soft, but it stretches out, sags, and wears thin at the heel. So this mill hides a stretchy spandex core inside the yarn, then wraps cotton around it until the thread still looks soft on the outside. Nylon joins where the sock takes the most punishment, the heel and toe. That blended yarn gets spun on a machine, wrapping cotton around the spandex core hundreds of times a minute before it ever reaches a needle. For the shopper, a touch of spandex in the blend is the real reason a sock snaps back into shape, wash after wash. The yarn feeds into a circular knitting machine. More than 100 tiny needles sit in a tight ring. Each one catches the yarn, pulls a loop, and lets the next needle take over. Round and round they go, and a soft tube of fabric grows downward like a stocking stretching into existence. This machine can spit out a finished sock in under a minute, fast enough that a single mill turns out tens of thousands of pairs a day. At the top, it knits a tighter ribbed band using elastic yarn, the same stretchy loop that keeps a sock from sliding down an ankle by lunchtime. A small detail nobody thinks to think.
Then, the machine reaches the one part that turns a tube into something shaped for a foot, the heel. A straight tube would slide right over the foot, but it would never hug the heel the way a sock actually needs to. So the machine pauses the full circle and works only one side of the sock, back and forth. Shorter rows at first, then wider rows until the flat tube slowly bends into a small, curved cup. The move is called short row knitting, building only part of the circle at a time until the heel curves out on its own. That little turn was so hard to automate that it took generations after the first knitting frames before machines could copy it well. And even now, it remains one of the fiddliest parts of the whole process. Snug, curved, and ready to cradle a heel. Once the pocket closes, the machine switches back to knitting in the round, and the tube keeps growing down toward the toe as if nothing unusual just happened at all. It's the quiet reason a well-made sock actually hugs your heel instead of bunching up inside a shoe. At the very end of the tube, the sock still has one gap left wide open, the toe. Closing it wrong would leave a lumpy seam pressing straight into a small toe with every step, so a specialized linking machine closes that final gap one tiny loop at a time instead of one quick seam. In some higher-end mills, a trained operator still guides that linking step by hand, watching each loop line up before it locks in. The reason is simple. When every loop matches its neighbor exactly, the toe lies flatter against the foot than any fully automated seam manages. That single seam is often the difference between a sock you forget you're wearing all day and one you keep tugging back into place. Closed, flat, and finally a complete sock.
From there, finished socks get paired up, folded into that familiar band and fold shape, and clipped together so they don't wander off into separate drawers before they even leave the factory. The label may show several shoe sizes, but the factory usually makes only a few true sock sizes. The spandex does the rest, stretching one sock across a wider range of feet. Before any pair ships out, inspectors look for dropped stitches, uneven tension, and heels that sit even a little off-center. One loose loop can turn into a hole after a single snag. One twisted heel can make the whole sock rotate under the foot. Random pairs are stretched, washed, and pulled over forms again and again because a sock only passes if it still hugs the heel after the factory has tried to wear it out. But not every cotton fiber is headed for something soft. Before spinning, it's graded by strength. The smoother fibers end up in socks. The toughest get woven into the denim in your closet.
More than 2 billion pairs of jeans sell worldwide every year, enough denim to clothe roughly 1 in 4 people on the planet. Before industrial looms, hand weavers could take days to produce enough sturdy cotton twill for 1 pair. This mill starts with something surprisingly plain: white cotton yarn, twisted into rope, ready for its first dip into color. Denim starts with the same plant as a t-shirt, but it asks more from the fiber. The cotton spins into thicker yarn, built for years of rubbing at knees, pockets, and seams. Several strands twist together, giving the yarn enough strength to survive dyeing, weaving, and daily wear. Once twisted, those yarns bundle into long ropes and coil onto spools, ready for their first plunge into color. Still snow white, with no hint yet of the blue to come. For the shopper, heavier denim, labeled by ounce weight, tends to outlast thin, lightweight denim. Those white cotton ropes now face indigo, and this is where the color trick begins. Fresh out of the vat, the yarn actually looks greenish-yellow, not blue at all. The blue only appears when oxygen from the air hits the dye, turning it that classic shade in seconds. One dip barely tints the surface, so the ropes get dunked, lifted into the air to oxidize, and dunked again, sometimes 8 times over, building the blue in thin layers, 1 dip at a time. Because each dip only coats the outside of the fiber, the inside of every thread stays pure white the whole time. A hidden white core waiting under the blue. On the loom, the trick becomes visible. The blue yarns run one direction, down the length of the fabric. The white yarns cross through them, side to side. As the loom locks the two together in denim's diagonal twill pattern, the slanted weave you can see up close. More blue shows on the outside, more white shows underneath. That is exactly why the inside of a pair of jeans looks pale, while the outside looks deep indigo. Flip open any pocket, and the fabric gives away its secret. A single loom can weave several yards of denim every minute, the shuttle clacking back and forth almost too fast to follow. And running dozens of looms side by side, this mill turns out enough fabric in a day to stitch thousands of pairs of jeans. Then the fabric faces the problem denim is famous for: shrinkage. If the mill cut it now, the first wash could change the fit entirely. So heat, moisture, and pressure pre-shrink the fabric before a single pair is ever cut, so the jeans you buy already sit close to the size on the tag. At the corners of the pockets, small metal rivets get hammered into place. They trace back to a 19th century tailor solving a simple problem. Miners kept ripping their pockets apart while hauling tools. Those same rivets still do the job today, holding the seam's weakest point together under real strain. Increasingly, mills also use a focused laser instead of chemicals or sandpaper to fade the fabric, burning away tiny amounts of blue dye in whatever pattern a design calls for. Whisker lines at the hips, soft fading at the knees, with far less water and fewer chemicals than older fading methods. A trained technician can program a laser to replicate a worn-in look that once took months of actual wear to develop. Crisp lines burned in seconds flat. From there, finished jeans get folded, tagged, and often given one final rinse and tumble to soften the fabric before they ever reach a hanger. The waistband tag does more than list a size. The ounce weight printed there hints at how heavy the denim felt before it ever became jeans, and how much wear it can take before the knees start to thin. Before shipping, inspectors check for skipped stitches, crooked seams, and rivets that sit even slightly offline. A misplaced rivet can rub against skin with every step. A weak seam can split the first time the fabric gets pulled hard. Random pairs are washed and tumbled again and again because good denim should fade in creases, not break into uneven blotches. But every rivet and seam here still needs a human hand to catch a flaw. The same laser that fades this denim can do something stranger: grow a whole shoe from powder, no seam to check. No mold, no block of foam. Somewhere in this factory, a running shoe sole is taking shape without either, grown instead one hair-thin layer of powder at a time,
fused solid by a laser sealed inside a machine.
About how that balance
Not long ago,
Yeah, it's
this was
something we
pure
are the
science
engineers,
fiction.
but we've worked very
Here,
closely with our
the
design
sole
team.
starts as nothing more than a bin of fine white powder.
Every one of these soles begins as something that looks nothing like footwear, a bin of fine white powder, soft as flour. That powder is TPU, a rubbery plastic used wherever a shoe needs spring and flex. Foam cushions by compressing as one solid piece. A printed lattice works differently, with thousands of tiny supports that flex, recover, and share the impact. A machine sieves that powder into an ultra-thin, even layer across the print bed. Smooth, barely thicker than a hair. For the shopper, if you can see an open lattice under the heel, that cushioning was printed, not poured as solid foam. A laser scans across that thin layer of powder, tracing the exact outline of the very bottom of the sole. And everywhere the beam touches, the powder melts together into solid plastic in an instant. Everywhere it doesn't touch, the powder just sits there, doing an important job nobody notices, holding up whatever gets printed above it.
That loose powder acts like a temporary scaffold, letting the machine build shapes a mold would struggle to release. Then another paper-thin layer of powder spreads on top, and the laser fires again. One layer down, thousands still to go. Layer by layer, that sole grows upward inside the machine. And this is where the real trick shows itself. It is not solid at all. Zoom in close, and it looks almost like coral or a honeycomb, a lattice of thousands of tiny plastic struts, each one only a fraction of a millimeter thick. The heel area prints tighter because that is where the foot lands hardest. The arch and forefoot print more open, so the sole can flex and push back as the foot rolls forward. One midsole alone can contain more than 20,000 individual struts, each one placed where the sole needs more cushion, more flex, or more support. A cushion built differently in the heel, arch, and forefoot instead of poured as one uniform block. Light to the eye, strong under the foot. Building one sole this way can take the better part of a full day, hour after hour of a laser tracing thousands of paper-thin layers, one on top of the last, until a solid shape emerges from what started as a bin of loose powder.
When the print ends, the machine still looks like nothing more than a box of powder. The finished midsole is hidden inside it, completely buried, until a technician reaches in and brushes the loose powder away by hand. That leftover powder isn't wasted. Much of it can be sifted and reused for the next print. Once uncovered, the printed sole is joined to a knit fabric upper, often with heat and pressure doing work that glue or stitching used to handle. Some custom programs go even further, using a 3D scan of the foot to adjust the lattice around one person's arch and heel. No two scans ever come out quite the same. Brushing away the powder to reveal a finished sole is oddly satisfying to watch. Clean, solid, and ready to wear. From there, the shoes are paired, laced up, and boxed like any other pair on a store shelf. Some boxes include a small card with a code that links the pair back to its print job, the machine, the batch, and the exact run that produced the sole, a level of traceability most molded foam shoes never get to show a customer at all. It's a small proof of exactly how that sole came to be. Before any pair ships, technicians test the lattice under repeated compression, pressing down thousands of times to mimic months of running in a single afternoon. A weak section can collapse early. A dense section in the wrong place can make one step feel harder than the next. Sole thickness gets scanned too, since even a small drift between heel and forefoot can change how the shoe lands underfoot. Only a lattice that passes every round moves on to packaging.
Next time you lace up running shoes, the cushion under your foot might not be foam at all, just a laser, a bed of powder, and thousands of tiny struts holding up every step.